These are the seats that we're going to be installing into the van. They're out of a 2019 Ford Transit, Ford Transit Custom I think they are. We've used them before. We fitted some of these into a Renault Master that we had as a family van a couple of years ago, and they've been great. The main reason, well, first and foremost, the main reason that we use them is because our children's seats fit them really well, and that's going to alter dependent on the seat that you've got. But we know that ours work well with them. You've got isofix built into them, and the seat belt is integral into the seat, and they were really big points for us. Not so much the isofix, but especially the seat belt. To anchor a seat belt into the back of a van that's never had a seat belt can be troublesome, and I've seen people reusing the bolts that the front seat belts anchor into and running them off them, which just seems daft to me. You're putting twice the load onto a bolt that was only ever designed to hold one belt. And these come with a lot of other benefits as well. They're quite a nice design. They're quite slim, so they don't take up a lot of room in the back. They do comfortably fit an adult in there. Well, it depends on the size of the adult, but for myself, I'm 13 stone, I can sit in them quite comfortably. They fold up and very easily fold up, so when they're not in use or when they haven't got the kids' car seats in, the backs fold down so they can be used as a bit of a makeshift table. And then when you want them out of the way, these two tabs at the bottom, you pull them, much easier when they're fixed in a van, and the seat folds up. And then if you want to completely remove them, there's a lever here. You pull the lever, that releases the brackets at the bottom, and the seat can be removed completely. All it leaves then is these brackets in the floor. Now on this installation, it'll become clearer on the floor installation video, but on our installation we're actually building covers. These get slightly sunk into the floor. We're building covers into them so that when the seats aren't in the van's got a completely flat floor and you don't have the bracket sitting into them. It's sticking out the floor. On the Renault Master we had this flange just sat on top of the ply, and then the vinyl covering that we had came up to the side, and it actually finished pretty flush with this, but you'd always got this gully. And we've got two dogs as well, two quite furry dogs. They do fill up with all sorts of stuff whilst you're away, from dog hair to, well, anything else that'll fit. So this time I've decided to just sink them into the floor a touch so that I can put a plate over the top to cover that off, and then we haven't got to think about that. These seats are quite heavy, but it's kind of reassuring in a way. I think a lot of it is down to the way that they're built. They're quite a thick gauge steel. It's all formed. Obviously they're built by Ford for going into Ford's vehicles. They go into a few different ones, but primarily the Transit Custom. So they've had all of their safety checks. They're safe to use. So long as they're bolted into the van, I haven't got to worry about anything else. If I was to build custom seats in the back with seat belts, then I'm getting into a whole different ball game, and I don't want that kind of responsibility. With these, I know full well, as long as I bolt them in securely and they're fastened in well, the seats, I'm not going to be able to get any safer in terms of the seats. So that's why we're using these, and this video just basically shows how I'm bolting these into the van, what I'm taking into account, how I'm getting over things like the ridges that are built into the floor, how I'm bolting them down. And then the rest of it is down to yourself in terms of how you want to finish your van. If you're putting these kind of seats into a van, you're going to have a height difference, and you'll see this in the installation video. The height difference here
between what will be the steel of your van and either your finished floor height or higher if you're doing the same as us is an ideal way to insulate your floor or soundproof it, or both. If you're not putting seats in, the way that we're constructing the floor would be exactly the same. It's just instead of having an additional layer of ply in, I'd be using something like a closed cell foam to create the insulation for the floor. But that's the only difference. So with these seats you can, and I have retrofitted them into a van that's already had the floor down. The only thing I did differently was that the ply that was already down I cut out to receive this inner shape. Everything else was identical, and that was so that this flange sat onto the floor. You do have to take into account that there are formed steel edges and welds. See if I can show you that a bit better. There you go. So these lips and welds that are holding this anchor point here, you do have to take those into account with your cuts. But apart from that, the installation stays exactly the same. In some ways it's actually easier to put them in once the floor's down. It just depends on what tooling you've got available and how easy it is for you to cut the hole in the floor that's going to receive these. The benefit of taking these into account before you fit the floor is that you can actually see more of what makes up the structure of the floor. So you can see the chassis rails, spot welds, and where you're actually going to put your fixings. But that's a judgment call for yourself.
Right, next bit's getting these seats fitted. These are out of a Transit Custom. So they fit these rails, basically get attached to the floor, and then the seat gets attached to the rails. So we've got 4 attachments to bolt these down. Seats, floor's in really good condition, but like on all vans we've got these ridges. So these press ridges are what give the floor strength, so we don't want to be cutting them out, flattening them out. Also got to be careful that when we bolt these down they don't squash those ridges out of there, because it is the ridges that give it strength. So I've looked at where the structural members are underneath, and that's where we've got a beam that runs down here, one that runs right the way across. The fuel tank on this is nowhere near, and the exhaust does hang underneath this area, but taking the exhaust off is really simple. And after everything that's been done to the engine, taking the exhaust off is nothing. So what I've been doing is measuring the height difference between the sheet at the bottom and the top of the ridge, which ranges between 8 and 10 mil. Well, what I'm going to do is pack them up with steel, so that we'll have a strip going down here that will sit on, so that I can drill straight the way through and bolt that down, and then I'll do something very similar underneath, whether it's with washers or whatever it is, so that when this is tightened up it doesn't crimp this steel, doesn't try and flatten the steel out, because you won't get the nuts as tight as they should be. They'll end up loosening off. I'm using nylock nuts and washers, so that should reduce a bit of that, but equally I don't want them becoming loose or slack, and if they're not tight, if there is a bump, they won't be as strong as they would be if they were tightened up. So there's basically 2 rails going here and another 2 rails going here, so that'll put the 2 seats sitting, so one seat, the rails will sit here, and then the rails will sit here. So I'll put the 2 seats at the front, and then with the driver's seat, passenger will be a single seat. When they're swiveled round, then we can turn around then to face the kids. That really limits the way that we can plan out this van. But in the UK, you have to have a forward facing seat to attach a child seat, and both of our kids are in kid seats. If we could have had the seats sideways on here, it would have opened the floor pan up, and it would have given us a range of different designs that we could use. Now I'm going to cut up, I'm using galvanised roof strapping. So I'm going to cut that to length, grind down the galv, clean up the floor, and start welding in some strips. They haven't got to be pretty, it's only there just to take the pressure off, or basically so that you can apply pressure when you're tightening up the bolts. Okay, so here's the seat set in. Because of these little bumps, these ridges, like I say, these are what give your floor its strength and stop it from being as bouncy, for want of a better expression. And if you can see the gap underneath where the runners sit, so we've got to fill that out so that when the bolt goes straight through, it doesn't flatten. I don't want it to flatten that dip. I would rather build it up with metal of some sort. And the other thing is, if you're willing to do that, some of them, they actually sit flush on the floor, like this one here. With this seat, because of the way that these ridges are, like this one here and this one here, because of the way that they're spaced, I can get this seat to sit flush on the floor, which is great. A lot less work. I can literally just drill through and bolt it. But then the seats don't sit as nice as I'd want them to. And this one, no matter what I do with it, one of the feet will be set up in the air. So I don't want to flatten out any of these. I'd much rather build up to them. So if I build up to all 4 of them so that they're all the same, it just makes life easier for doing the floor. But obviously, if I build up at the top, when it comes time to bolt through, I also need to support the underside of this so that when the bolt comes to crimp it up, it doesn't flatten out this side just through tightening the bolt out, because it's only 1mm steel, so it will flatten out really well. The other thing is, these brackets are heavy, very heavyweight, thick steel. I've not put the caliper on them yet, but they look to me like they're about 3mm. So the way I'm fixing these down is building this up with my galved steel, same underneath this from underneath, and then I've got a 6mm piece of steel plate that I'm using as a great big washer to go right the way across them, so that purely so that I've got the rigidity there. And then if ever we were in a bump, it would be very, very difficult for one of these to rip itself out the floor, because the weight will be spread across a big portion of the floor, and that big surface area will hopefully reduce any chances of the seats coming out the floor. In fact, that'll be the strongest part of the van probably. Okay, so I've got the seats sat in the van pretty much where I want them. What I've tried to take into account is the space at the side where I'm going to need to put the wall board, the thickness of any covering and all the rest of it. So I've just taken a measurement off that. That'll be different in different vans depending on how you're building your walls out. And I've used this seam here as a guide, so I've taken my measurement from there, thickness of my ply, thickness of any covering. Also tried to take into account any sockets, like we're going to have a 12-volt socket that's down here, so any back boxes, anything else that's going to need to go down there, insulation, and leave enough room at the side of this seat to take that into account. It doesn't look like it on the camera, but there is enough room there. And then try to take into account leg space. So I'm building this van purely around, get focus, need a better camera, there we go. So leg space, I've tried to give as much leg space as I can, but I'm dictated to by the length of the bed, what I've got going in here, also kid seats and all the rest of it, and front seat swiveling. So when that seat gets replaced and there's a swivel there, you've got to have leg room. So I'm going to have to build out this step here so that that person's got foot space, still leave that person with foot space, and still leave as much of a bed as possible. And I'm trying to get that to a minimum sort of 6'2", 6'4", if I can. Anything over 6 foot I'm happy with, but I want to try and give as much length there on the bed as possible. So that got me to that point, getting them roughly in place. And then underneath, I'm using the galvanised roofing strap that I've cut down. I don't know if you can see them sat there. I'll take the seats out in a minute so that you can see them properly. So that's a heavyweight strap and a lightweight strap. They sell them as about 5mm and 2.5mm, but they're not. They're close though. And when they're stacked up like that on this van, it is the same, pretty much identical height to these, but depending on how the van's being used, some of these get a bit squished. You can see where the main beam runs across here. They get slightly bent over the main beam. Depends how much abuse the van's had, so that'll be different in different cases. What I thought with these is, if I get them close enough, if I needed to shim it up with a washer or something like that to get them flat, then I can do, but it's worked out really well for me on this van. So at the minute these are just sat in loose, but I'm just going to run a couple of tack welds. There's a slight step in these. I'm just going to run a couple of tack welds down the edge just to hold the two together. These will get tack welded flush. This one sits on the top of the floor quite nicely, and then this one again, I'll just weld the two together, just tack them together. Then once they're together as one piece, it will make life easier. And then inside on these rails, if I can show you, there's a couple of holes. These rails come with a like a location dowel that sticks out the bottom. I've ground them off these, I don't need them on this, it's easier with them out the way. But you can always just pop a tack screw through the holes just to hold the rail in place whilst you drill. I'm using M10 bolts, M10 bolts, washers and nylock nuts that will go through that square hole there. So once the galv straps are in place, I can then drill through all in one go and my holes will be in the right place. And then I can use the 6mm plate underneath to create a big washer. Now there's a beam that runs up here, quite a big beam under the floor. So on this I'll have a big 6mm plate that runs between these two bolts, one that goes the full length of this one, and then on this side I'll put a plate that goes across these two and then across the two at the front. Just give it as much surface area as I can, so that again, if we were ever in a bump and the seats wanted to go forward, at least the surface area is as big as I can get it. That should be pretty solid then. I don't think there's any way I could make it more solid. There's a lot of steel going back in. There's none coming out of the van, and there's a lot of steel going back into the van. And I would imagine it's down to the sheer strength of the bolts then. So you can get different strength bolts. You've got to do your own calculations on that. I'm not going to tell anybody what to use. You wouldn't sleep at night if you told somebody what to use and it was wrong. So do that on your, take that on your own shoulders. But that's how the seats will be getting fitted in. I'll just show you now with the seats removed. Okay, so this is just the galv strips. So they are literally just roofing strips, but they're already galvanised, so they're pretty well covered. And they just sit in between those gullies, and they're pretty close to being exactly flush across the top. Here I've marked out where the beams are. Again, that'll be different for different vans. Obviously check to make sure there's no fuel tank underneath. The exhaust isn't a problem. Most vans, you've got enough room to lie down underneath them. And on this van, there's only one V-clamp that holds the main back box to the downpipe. They're so easy to take out. Literally just a couple of spanners and it's out. So that's what I'll be using. So I'll get these tack welded up now. If it's galvanised, it's always worth just grinding off a bit of the galv. I'll just be putting a couple of tacks down the edge, but you'll make life a lot easier for yourself if you get rid of the galv first. And obviously make sure it's ventilated and all that malarkey. Okay, so these are the roofing straps. All I've done with these is just stuck some tacks in them just to hold them together, and I've just filled up some of the holes. It's a bit of a pig to weld. It's galvanised, and on this I've got two thicknesses, so one wants to melt and the other one doesn't want to penetrate, so they're not pretty, but it's much easier to deal with them in one piece. Where I've filled the holes, that's purely just to make it easier for drilling, rather than the drill wandering down into one of the pre-drilled holes. So that's what's going in under the chairs. I'm just going to get them spaced out now, and then use some hot glue just to sort of hold them in place whilst I get the drilling done. Okay, it's really difficult to film this as I'm doing it, so I'm just trying to show you regular updates. And there we go. Right, so trying to find a datum on this is pretty hard work. So I've gone off this seam here. It seemed to be pretty level across the whole van. Couldn't measure from the front because of where it kicks in here, and this seam isn't as pronounced as the one at the back. So for my design here, I've just measured 200mm from this lip to the bottom of each one of these, and then I've just used hot glue just to hold them in place, just really to give me a fighting chance to get the seats on and off, get the seats levelled up where I want them. Now measuring from there to there just makes sense, it's shorter distance, and just hoping that the two sides run parallel. I don't see any reason why they shouldn't. I've taken some measurements and they all seem fine, and like I said, these are pretty big holes, so there is a bit of wiggle room on them, but I don't know if you can pick up, the holes are falling where the sheet metal underneath curves, so it's literally going to be knock a point, start off with a small drill bit and work my way up to the 10mm. So we'll just have to see how we go. Like I say, it's just with where I am and how I am, it's just really difficult to set the phone up to record this. So I'll get these drilled and then I'll bring you back in for an update. Okay, so just done exactly what I said. Just punched first, built up with the drill bits. It's such thin steel at the bottom on the floor. It'll be a bit more hard work going through the galv straps, but the actual steel of the floor is really thin, it goes through as quick. But then, let's see, you've got a fair bit of movement on these. I might actually have a look at just increasing the size of the bolts, but I have used these before. I mean, I take these particular runners I've taken out of a Renault Master that I put them in before. I fitted them brand new. It's my own van, so no, it's not been in any bumps or anything, and I fitted them this way, never had an issue, because obviously with the ply going around as well, everything stays secure. So all I'm doing is repeating the way that I did it before, and they've worked perfectly. They've been in that van for 2 or 3 years and never ever had an issue. So just got to do the same process now for the others, and then that should be the seats fitted.